Hey, 7th grade. We have book 4 for day 1 of our remote learning. This one is Across 5 Aprils. We're just going to jump in. Ellen Cretan and her 9-year-old son Jethro were planting potatoes in the half-acre just south of their cabin that morning in mid-April 1861. They were out in the field as soon as breakfast was over, and southern Illinois at that hour was pink with sunrise and swelling redbud and clusters of bloom over the apple orchard across the road. Jethro walked on the warm clods of plowed earth and felt them crumble beneath his feet as he helped his mother carry the tub of potato cuttings they had prepared for the night before. "It's damp fur down and warm on top," he remarked, poking a brown hand deep into the soil. "Once we get these planted and a soft rain comes, we'll have a crop to make people up north call us Egypt for sure." He filled the burlap pouch with the potato cuttings and hoisted it expertly to his thin shoulder where a batch of new freckles was just beginning to appear. The world seemed a good place to him that morning, and he felt ready to stride down the length of the field with a firm step and a joke on his lips. "Do you reckon we'll be through by the time ham and cornbread is ready for dinner, Miss Cretan?" he asked, grinning. He called her Miss Cretan sometimes, as his older brothers did when they teased her. It was just a step from the too bold joke of addressing her by her given name. His mother smiled back at him, acknowledging his mood, but she shook her head at his words. "Your hopes is making a fool of your reason, Jeth. We're lucky if these taters is bedded by noon tomorrow." She made short, quick cuts with her hoe in the mellow soil, and waited until Jethro placed a cutting, eye upward, in the spot hollowed out for it, after which she raked a covering of soil over it and moved down the long furrow. She was a small, spare woman with large dark eyes and skin as brown and dry as leather. She had been a pretty girl back in the 1830s when she married Matthew Cretan, but prettiness was short-lived among country women of her time. She didn't think much about it anymore, except now and then when Jenny's 14-year-old radiance was especially compelling. Even if she had been concerned, there were reverberations of Calvinism strong within her, which would have protested vigorously against the vanity of regret for a passing beauty. She had borne 12 children, 4 of whom were dead, perhaps 5, for the oldest son had not been heard from since he left for the gold fields of California 12 years before. She had lived through poverty, sickness, and danger for over 30 years. The sight of a pretty face might bring a tired smile to her lips, but it was a thing of little value in Ellen's world. Jethro was her youngest son, born in the year of 52, a year in which 3 of her children died within 1 week of the dreaded disease they called child's paralysis, a disease which struck the country that year, people said, like the soldiers of Herod. Ellen knew that she favored her youngest son, that she overlooked shortcomings in Jethro for which her older children had been punished. It was a weakness of her advancing years, she supposed, but this was the son who had been spared that summer when children all around were dying of the agonizing sickness. It looked as if, somehow, destiny had marked him. One didn't talk about such things. The world, she knew, was impatient with women who value their own children too highly. Ellen kept her silence, but she saw signs of special talents in Jethro, and she watched over him with special tenderness. They worked together for an hour or more without speaking. Ellen was grave and absorbed in the anxious thoughts of that spring. Jethro was accustomed to adapting himself to the behaviors and moods of older people, and he found enough in the world about him to occupy his interest as he worked. A south breeze brought the scent of lilacs and sweet fennel to his nostrils, and set all the frosty green leaves of a silver poplar tree to trembling. There was a column of wood smoke feathering up from the kitchen chimney, a sign that Jenny was already making preparations for a hearty noon meal. From the neighboring field across the creek, he could hear the shouted commands to the plow horses as Matt Cretan and his 2 older sons got on with the spring plowing. It was a fine morning. Many people around him were troubled, he knew, but that was a part of the adult world which he accepted as a matter of course. Adults were usually troubled. There were chinch bugs and grasshoppers, months of drought, elections, slavery, secession, talk of war. The adult world of trouble, though, was not real enough to dim the goodness of an April morning. At about 7 o'clock, a team and wagon pulled out of the barn lot, stopping for a minute before turning into the road while the driver spoke to a girl who came running out of the kitchen door. Jethro chuckled. "Shad's leaving for Newton now, I guess. Jenny has to say goodbye, like as if he was going to the North Pole." He watched the wagon from the corner of his eye as he worked. When the team started coming down the road toward the potato patch, he put the heavy bag of cuttings aside and raced across the field to the roadside. His mother laid down her hoe and followed slowly, picking her way over the mounds of plowed earth that Jethro's feet seemed barely to touch. The young schoolmaster stopped the team and climbed down from the wagon to stand at the fence row, waiting for Jethro and Ellen to come up from midfield. He was a tall, powerful-built youth of 20, with a firm mouth and grave, dark-set eyes that gave him the appearance of an older man. He had come out from Pennsylvania 3 years earlier to study at McKendree College, where an uncle was professor of natural philosophy, a subject that later generations would call physics. Faced with insufficient funds to carry on his studies at the end of his first year, young Yale had turned to the country schools as a stepping stone toward further work in college, and a series of circumstances had led him to the school for which Matt Cretin served as a director. Here he had stayed, not just 1 year as originally planned, but 2, and now in 1861 he had hired himself out as a farmhand to Matt for the summer and contracted to teach still a 3rd term that fall. He had been stricken with typhoid fever during her first year of teaching, and Ellen Cretin had patiently nursed him back to health with the skills she had learned over the years. There was a strong tie of affection between the two of them. Ellen counted Shadrach as a part of her family and looked after him as she did her own, and Shadrach Yale, in turn, showed a thoughtful courtesy for her that few women of the prairies received from their own sons. "Will you be back by supper time, Shad?" Jethro called breathlessly as he approached the fence row. At school he addressed the young teacher as master, but now that Shadrach was so much a member of the family, the necessary formalities of a schoolroom were forgotten. "It's not likely, Jeth, not before 9 or maybe later." Shadrach smiled at the thin, eager face turned up to him. He was mature enough at 20 to appreciate being a hero to a 9-year-old boy. Besides that, Jethro's quick mind and delight in learning had been a source of pleasure for studious young Yale, who had known the frustration of trying to penetrate the apathy and unconcern of a backwoods classroom. He had talked to both parents about the promise he recognized in the boy. Matt, in spite of his pleasure, had shaken his head and wondered if the praise for Jethro had not stemmed from interest in Jethro's sister, Jenny. But Ellen had felt no doubts. The praise was in line with what she herself believed firmly. She stood beside the gray rails that morning with her hands folded beneath her apron. Matt had made a pretext of needing supplies from town, but she knew that this trip to Newton in the midst of a late planting season would have been unthinkable, except for the urgency of getting word from the world beyond their own fields and woods pastures. Her face looked drawn in the bright sunlight. "I wish there was a telegraph in Newton, Shad," she said. He nodded. "There's one in Olney. They'll send any important news on up to Newton as soon as it comes through. At any rate, I'll bring the latest papers. Seems sometimes there's a deep silence all about us out here waiting to be filled." She and the young man looked at each other, each pair of eyes dark with anxiety. Jethro kicked a stone in the road. "Sure wish I was going to town with you, Shad," he said finally, because it seemed that someone must say something. "I know. Well, there'll be other trips this summer, Jeff." Shadrach started to climb back into the wagon as he spoke. Then, changing his mind, he turned back and placed his hands quickly on Ellen's shoulders. "Try not to worry," he said quietly. The caress brought sudden tears to her eyes. She and Jethro stood watching as he drove away. When the wagon disappeared in a clump of trees at a bend in the road, Ellen turned back to her work slowly, as if overwhelmed by a deep weariness. "The Lord knows what news he'll bring back," she said. "There may be war in the land at this minute, for all we know." Jethro was depressed by her somber mood, but not by the imminence of war. He had listened to his brother Tom and their cousin Eb, the 2 younger of the grown boys in the household, and their excitement had found its way into his blood. Dread of war was a womanly weakness, he had discovered, evidenced by his mother's melancholy and the tears of Jenny and his brother John's wife, Nancy. "I heard some of the big fellers talking the other night, and they said the war, even if it comes, will be no more than a breakfast spell. They said that soldiers up here can take the South by the britches and make it holler no quicker than it takes coffee to cool off for swallering." Jethro spoke hurriedly, almost sure that the words would anger his mother, and vaguely realizing that he wanted to anger her a little for spoiling the brightness of the morning by her obvious sadness. She had a way of closing her eyes briefly when exasperated, as if to reject for at least a second the existence of a folly that she was bound to recognize later. Her hoe jabbed deeper and more sharply into the brown earth at her feet. "They're foolish young'uns, and they're talking without a spark of reason to guide their words," she said angrily. "It ain't that I don't love 'em, big talk or not," she added, "but I'm fearful of the day when they face their comeuppance. I'm fearful of the time when I'll have no boys left but you and the 3 little ones up on Walnut Hill." Jethro squirmed inwardly. If there were going to be tears and talk of the children who had died the summer he was born, he wanted to escape. And since one didn't easily escape from his mother in the midst of planting a half-acre of potatoes, he searched hurriedly for a way to turn the conversation. "Did I ever tell you, Ma, of an old feller that give all the people of the earth their comeuppance?" he asked brightly, knowing that she was always proud to hear of the things he'd learned from Shadrach at school. "I reckon you didn't, Jeth, not that I'm able to recollect." Jethro straightened his shoulders a little under the weight upon them. "Well, ma'am, there was a long time when people allowed that the earth was the big kingpin amongst all the stars and things. They thought that the moon and sun and all the stars went round the earth, and maybe kind of tipped their hats as they went by. Shad says that most everybody went on believing that for years, till finally there come along a man I'm telling you about. He was head and shoulders smarter than the run-of-the-mill, and after he'd watched the sun and the moon and the stars for a long time, he set down and done some figuring. Well, when he got through figuring, he showed it to some other fellers, and there it was, plain as anything. The earth wasn't the big kingpin after all. He allowed it was just a little old star chasing around the sun with a pack of others, some of them a lot bigger than us. Shad says that some folks took that news real hard. It kind of let the wind out of their sails all of a sudden. That ain't in the scriptures, is it, Jeth? I don't reckon so, but it's in one of the books Shad brought out from Philadelphia. His mother looked thoughtful. "The Lord God created the earth and all upon it, Jeth. I don't like to hear that his work weren't the best." "But don't you see, Ma? He created the sun and the moon and the stars, too. Some a little bigger, others maybe a little prettier. Seems like people on earth believed we had the best diggins just because we wanted to believe that, because it made us feel important. You ain't watching to keep that tater eyes facing up, Jeth," Ellen said quietly, pointing with the tip of her hoe. He stooped and turned to cutting over. "Guess I kind of got carried away with my own noise," he said, flushing. Her eyes lighted a little. "Well, you done me a favor, telling me things I ain't never learned and giving me something to ponder over. It amazes me, Jeth. It does for a fact, the way you can recollect all the things Shad tells you, and how you can put them from his way of talking into mine." She hoed in silence for a minute, then paid him the great compliment of going back to his story. "Did you tell me what the old feller's name was, the one that done all the figuring?" "His name was Copernicus. I can even spell it for you if you're a mind. Shad made me learn how to say it and spell it, too." "Sounds like a furriner." Jethro nodded. "I allow," he agreed. Ellen sighed. "Seems like furriners is allus a-stirring up something. Well, the pot can't call the kettle black. Look what we're stirring up amongst ourselves." She was back to the problems of the times, and Jethro knew that he could not tempt her away from them. For months he had moved along the edge of the furor that raged among the adults of his family, of the neighborhood, and even of the church. He knew that there had been fights in the neighborhood, anger and triumph over the election of President Lincoln in the fall of '60, but he supposed, if he thought of it at all, that this was the natural behavior of people interested in a vague thing called politics. He had heard talk of tariffs, of slave states and free ones, of a violent old man named John Brown, and during the past winter, of states seceding from the Union. But it had just been talk to him, and the only part of all the talk that held any interest for him was the conviction among all the men that war was sure to break out sooner or later. It hadn't broken out yet, however, and some men were swearing because the president had not declared war, while others were saying, just let old Abe fire on the South and watch Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, yes, maybe even southern Illinois, tumble over the Confederate side of the fence. He knew a little about wars. The Revolution, of course. The American Revolution, Shadrach had pointed out, and Jethro had been amazed that there was ever any other. He liked stories of war. There was a beautiful one described in one of Shad's books in which an ancient king watched ships fight in a place called Salamis Bay. There was another exciting story of a battle in which small, fast ships, with the lucky help of a violent storm, had played Old Ned with a proud and mighty navy. He wanted to tell his mother about that one, how if the battle had gone the other way, both Ellen and Jethro Cretan might well have been speaking Spanish as they planted their potatoes that April morning. She wouldn't have liked that, though. She was suspicious of people who spoke a different language. Well, one learned when to speak and when to keep one's tongue between his teeth. Jethro was not going to talk to his mother too much of either languages or wars, but he knew that, as far as the latter was concerned, he was one with young Tom and Eb when they hoped that war would come soon. War meant loud brass music and shining horses ridden by men wearing uniforms finer than any suit in the stores at Newton. It meant men riding like kings, looking neither to the right or left, while lesser men in perfect line strode along with guns across their shoulders, their heads held high like horses with short reins, when the battle thundered and exploded on all sides. Well, some men were killed, of course, but the stories of war that Jethro remembered were about the men who had managed to live through the thunder and explosion. Matt Cretan's grandfather had lived through the Revolution. Matt himself had survived the Mexican War, and Uncle Billy Jeffers down the road was still alive to tell the tales of the War of 1812. Jethro, forgetting the lecture to his mother on the inclination of people to select beliefs that bring them the most satisfaction, never doubted that if Tom and Eb got their chance to go to war, they'd be back home when it was over, and then it would be shadowy men from distant parts who would die for the pages of future history books. Death, however, was neither simple nor lightly brushed aside when it struck home. Jethro frowned. He didn't like to think of his sister Mary's death, but some memory had been touched off as his thoughts wandered. Let a few hours of work go by and let one's body begin to weary a little. Then the thoughts that had been all of beauty and spring a while before started turning to things that were better forgotten. He had not forgotten, though. He'd been only 7 that winter of '59, but the memory of the tragedy would always be sharp and terrible in his mind. Mary had always been as pretty as Jenny, only blonde and more delicate. Jethro remembered that it was a bitter night, and that he had stood with his nose pressed against the cold window pane, watching Rob Nelson help her into the wagon before they left for a dance over toward Hidalgo. What happened later he'd pieced together from the loud outcries and scraps of conversation deep in the middle of the night. It seemed that a crowd of young toughs from the south of the county had broken uninvited into the dance, waving whiskey bottles and shouting drunken insults at the guests. As things began to look more and more dangerous, Rob found Mary's wraps, and they were starting for home when a drunken youth named Travis Burdo saw them leave and followed them on horseback. Rob told Matt Cretan how he had urged the team, hoping to get to Ed Turner's farm where he could get help, because he knew that Burdo was armed. Rob had succeeded in getting as far as Turner's driveway when Burdo, seeing that his game was about finished, rode up beside Rob's team and fired a pistol over the head of the horses. The frightened animals bolted through a rail fence, overturning the wagon and kicking themselves loose from the tongue. Mary was dead when Rob and Ed Turner pulled her from the wreckage. The countryside was in an uproar the next day when the news of the tragedy got around. Matthew Cretan was held in high esteem by his neighbors, and the senseless killing of his daughter stirred up a rage that was heightened by the fact that the whole Bordeaux family was commonly despised throughout the countryside as a shiftless lot with a bad background. The grandfather of Travis Burdo had come from somewhere farther downstate, and when he moved into Jasper County, he came hurriedly, in order, so the story went, to escape a mob of citizens whose anger during years of petty thieving had exploded over the theft of a team of horses from a prosperous farmer. Whether the story was true or not, suspicion and dislike settled upon the family, and 30 years had failed to dissipate it. The Burdo children were nicknamed jail Burdos by taunting schoolmates and persecuted in 100 petty ways. Dave Burdo, the father of young Travis and son of the alleged horse thief, was a sullen, silent man who shunned people in general and accepted their insults as a matter of course when he was forced to deal with them. His sons, for the most part, were much like him, except when liquor quickened their courage and defiance. The shot that Travis Burdo fired over Rob Nelson's team that night was a shot fired at a society that had kicked a boy from childhood on because he bore his grandfather's name. And so the anger of the mob at Mary's death was doubled and tripled because a Burdo was responsible. By late afternoon, a crowd of 50 or more armed men stopped at the Cretan cabin to tell Matt of their intention of hunting Travis Burdo down and hanging him on the spot. But Matt Cretan intervened, and it was a mark of the respect he commanded in the community that the men listened as he stood for an hour in the icy afternoon, pleading with them to keep their hands free of further bloodshed. Jethro, understanding the situation more fully now that he was older, wondered at his father's intervention that morning. His own sympathies, even on a spring morning 18 months later, were with the angry men as they had prepared for the manhunt. He wondered. He had great confidence in his father, but his sense of justice was hard put to accept the fact that Travis Bordeaux had been allowed to escape the consequences of his drunken crime. It occurred to him that he felt the same way towards his father as he did toward Abraham Lincoln. Why should the president waver so long? Why should he refuse, week after week, to start the great explosion which the young men wanted to get started and have finished before the year was well into summer? Jethro had to admit to himself an uncomfortable feeling of anger for both the president and his father. They had not shown the hard, unyielding attitude that he admired in the talk of Tom and Eb and their friends. He sighed suddenly and deeply at his perplexities. Ellen noticed the sigh and glanced at him quickly. "Be you spent, Jethro?" He shook his head. "No, I'm doing tolerable. I was just thinking about things." "What kind of things, son?" "For one, I was wondering why Abe Lincoln can't make up his mind about war. I wonder, is he like Pa? He's so against having blood on people's hands that he is afeard to start a war?" Ellen stopped her work and stood a moment without speaking, her rough brown hands resting on the handle of the hoe. "He's like a man standing where two roads meet, Jeth," she said finally. "And one road is as dark and fearsome as the other. There ain't a choice between the two, and yet a choice has to be made." She shook her head. "May the Lord help him," she whispered. "May the Lord guide his hand." The sounds of morning were all around them as they stood silently in the middle of the furrow. From the fields across the creek came the monotonous shout to the field horses. Up at the house, Jenny's voice came clearly, pleasant as the sound of a little bell ringing. "Here, Chick," she called. "Here, Chick, 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 Chick." Ellen slowly reached out with her hoe and broke a clod of dirt into crumbling fragments. "Well, we got planting to do, Jeth," she said at last, and they went on with their work. All right, we're going to stop across 5 Aprils there. I hope you guys have a fabulous Monday, and I miss seeing you guys. My day is not quite the same without you. Look forward to more books tomorrow.